My children sat me down at the most exclusive restaurant in Boston just to tell me how embarrassing I was. For years, I had endured their condescending remarks and ungrateful attitude. But that night was the final straw. They ordered me to just sit there and be quiet, treating me like a prop to impress their rich friends. They thought I was just their clueless old mother, but they had no idea that I owned the very ground they were sitting on, and I was about to serve them a dish of humiliation they would never forget. It was the week before Christmas, and the silence in my little house was the comfortable, familiar kind. Then I heard the sound of a German engine idling outside, too loud and aggressive for my quiet suburban street. That was my signal. My children, Chelsea and Ryan, had arrived for their brief, obligatory visit. I smoothed the front of my apron and opened the door before they had a chance to ring the bell. Chelsea swept in first, bringing a gust of cold air and expensive perfume with her. Her cheerfulness was a thin, brittle thing, like ice on a puddle. She gave me a quick air kiss on each cheek, and her eyes were already scanning the living room, not with affection, but with assessment. She told me the house looked cozy, but the way she said it made it sound small and dated. Ryan followed her, quieter and more subdued, giving me a real hug that still felt hesitant, as if he were being pulled in two directions at once. Throughout their visit, Chelsea couldn't seem to put her phone down. She'd check it every few minutes, her thumb scrolling anxiously, her brow furrowed with a stress that had nothing to do with me or this little house. After about 20 minutes of stilted small talk, Chelsea presented what she called my real Christmas gift. She pulled a thick, embossed card from her designer handbag and handed it to me. It was a dinner reservation for the three of us on Christmas Eve at a place called Aurelia, apparently the most exclusive and sought-after restaurant in Boston. She framed it as this grand, generous gesture, but her explanation was laced with a condescension so thick I could taste it. She told me not to worry, that she and Ryan would handle everything. She explained the dress code, the kind of people who went there, the level of etiquette required, all as if I were a child who'd never been out to a nice meal in her life. She finished by saying they just wanted me to be comfortable because it was a very specific kind of place. The message underneath it all was painfully clear. Don't you dare embarrass us. I simply smiled, looked at the reservation, and told her it sounded wonderful. They left soon after, their duty done for the week. The house felt quiet again, but this time the silence had a different quality. It was charged. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at my old desktop computer. I typed Aurelia, Boston into the search bar. The pictures that came up were just as opulent as Chelsea had described. Gleaming chandeliers, velvet booths, photos of celebrities and politicians smiling for the camera. The founder was a famous chef, a man I knew of. But I wasn't interested in the restaurant reviews. My fingers, guided by decades of habit from my old job as a financial analyst, clicked on the About Us page, then navigated to their corporate information. It took me less than 5 minutes of digging through public filings to find exactly what I was looking for. The primary investor, the silent majority partner behind the whole glittering enterprise, was a blind trust. A trust I had set up myself almost 10 years ago. I was standing at the living room window watching their car lights cut through the early evening darkness when their voices drifted back towards the house. The car door was still open, and the cold winter air carried their words clearly. It was Chelsea, her voice stripped of all its fake cheer, sharp and tight with a panic that was startling to hear. She was practically hissing at Ryan. She said they had to keep up appearances, especially now. That if the right people, some couple named Martin, saw them at Aurelia, it could open doors for them. Then came the line that landed like a punch to the gut. She said Mom just needed to play along for one night. After the new year, she didn't know what they were going to do. Hearing that raw desperation, that mention of a deadline, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just about my children being snobs. This was about fear. They were terrified of something, and for some reason, this dinner was at the very center of it all. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. For the next few days, the knowledge of my children's desperation sat with me. It wasn't a loud, angry feeling, but a quiet, heavy one. The shock had worn off, and what was left was a sad clarity. Their cruelty wasn't just a character flaw. It was a symptom of a deeper illness, a panic so profound they were willing to use their own mother as a shield. I knew then that I couldn't just let it go. This wasn't something a quiet talk over tea could fix. So I decided it was time to make my first move a small test to see just how fragile their carefully constructed world really was. I picked up the phone and dialed Chelsea's number. When she answered, her voice was clipped and businesslike, as if my call was an interruption. I put on my most harmless, slightly dithering voice. I told her I was just thinking about that lovely restaurant Aurelia, and I had a question about what to wear. I mentioned an old cashmere shawl I owned, explaining that it was a beautiful piece, but perhaps a bit dated. I asked in the most innocent tone I could manage if she thought that would be all right, or if I should try to find something a little more modern. I was dangling a piece of bait, presenting myself as the out-of-touch mother she already believed me to be. The reaction was immediate, and exactly what I expected, only more intense. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a strained silence. Then her voice came back tight and completely devoid of its earlier false patience. She told me, "No, Mom, absolutely not." She insisted I was to wear the black dress they had sent over and nothing else. She pleaded with me not to experiment, her voice rising slightly. She said that everything just had to be perfect. Her frantic need for control was so raw, so out of proportion to a simple question about a shawl, that it told me everything. This one dinner was carrying the entire weight of their world. Her social survival was hanging by a thread, and she saw my old shawl as a pair of scissors. After I hung up, my resolve settled into something firm and cold. My daughter's panic had given me all the confirmation I needed. I then made a second, much different phone call. I dialed the private line for the general manager at Aurelia, a man named Jean-Paul Dubois. I'd known him for years, having recommended him for the job myself after he'd managed a boutique hotel my late husband and I had invested in. He was a man of immense discretion and loyalty. He answered warmly, and I explained that I would be dining at the restaurant on Christmas Eve. I gave him a specific set of instructions for the reservation, making a few unusual requests about the table and the service, which he agreed to without a single question. I didn't tell him the whole story, but he knew my tone. He simply said it would be an honor to have me, and that everything would be handled exactly as I wished. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text message from Chelsea. Believing she had successfully managed the shawl crisis, her tone was once again patronizing and controlling. The text confirmed the reservation for 7 o'clock and instructed me to be ready by 6:15, as they would be picking me up to avoid any issues with parking. Reading those words, her oppressive micromanagement felt less like an insult and more like a desperate attempt to nail down every last variable in a world that was spinning out of her control. It was pathetic, but it was also dangerous. That text solidified it for me. The lesson they needed to learn had to be taught on the stage they had chosen. It had to be as public as the image they were so terrified of losing. In the quiet aftermath of my decision, the first step was to play the part they had cast for me. I picked up my phone and replied to Chelsea's controlling text from the hour before. My fingers typed a simple, clean message. I told her, "Of course, dear, and thank you for handling everything." It was the perfect response, exactly what the slightly clueless, grateful mother she imagined me to be would say. For the next few days leading up to Christmas Eve, I was the model of compliance. I didn't bring up the dinner again. When Chelsea called to check in, her voice still a little tight, I was pleasant and asked about her work. I could feel her relaxing with each passing day, believing she had successfully managed the mother problem and that the stage was perfectly set for her performance. While I was tending to my poinsettias and wrapping small gifts for old friends, a very different scene was unfolding across town in their gleaming minimalist Back Bay apartment. I couldn't have known the exact details then, but I could feel the shape of their desperation. The truth was, their life was a lie, held together by sheer willpower. On their cold marble countertop, amidst catalogs for luxury watches, lay a pile of letters with angry red stamps. Final demand. They were drowning. A few months earlier, they had lost nearly everything, over 70% of their life savings, in a sophisticated private equity scam that targeted ambitious young professionals just like them. To cover it up, they'd taken out a massive high-interest loan, and now that loan was coming due. They were arguing bitterly, the fear making their voices sharp and cruel. Their last desperate hope was this dinner at Aurelia. They believed that if they could just impress the right people, schmooze a big investor, that Chelsea's husband, Mark, could land a deal big enough to save them. As Mark told her, his voice hollow with exhaustion, the dinner had to work. They were out of time. They were consumed by their panic, but I was focused on my preparation. I had no interest in shopping for a new dress. The one they sent would do just fine as a costume. Instead, I took a quiet trip downtown to my bank. I was led into the cold, silent vault, a place of quiet order that I'd always found calming. I unlocked my safe deposit box, the metal door swinging open smoothly. Inside, beneath my late husband's wedding ring and some old bonds, were the items I needed. I retrieved the original notarized incorporation documents for the restaurant's parent company, my name listed clearly as the sole director of the trust. Beside it was a small framed photograph that had never been made public, a picture of me and the head chef, arms around each other, laughing on the restaurant's opening night. I wrapped both items carefully in silk and placed them in the bottom of my handbag. The night before the dinner, the phone rang. It was Chelsea making one last check-in call. Her arrogance, which had been tempered by her panic, was now fully restored. She believed she was in the final moments of a successful operation. Her tone was condescendingly cheerful. She was just calling to remind me, she said, that tomorrow night it would be best to let her and Ryan do most of the talking. There would be important people there, she explained, as if I didn't understand the concept. That was her final critical mistake. In that moment, she completely underestimated me, viewing me not as her mother, not as an intelligent woman, but as a passive object to be positioned and managed for her own benefit. I didn't feel a sting of hurt, not anymore. I just felt a quiet final click as the last piece of my resolve locked into place. I simply told her that sounded very sensible, and I would see them tomorrow. When Chelsea and Ryan arrived on Christmas Eve to pick me up, I was ready. I was wearing the simple black dress they had sent a blank canvas for the evening's events. The drive into Boston was mostly silent. I stared out the window at the festive city lights, while Chelsea chattered nervously, filling the quiet with talk about her work and the people she expected to see. Ryan just drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They were walking into the most important performance of their lives, and I was the prop they were carefully positioning. When we pulled up to Aurelia, the entrance was a grand affair of twinkling lights and valets in crisp uniforms. Chelsea swept out of the car, ready to announce her arrival. But the moment we stepped inside, the first thread of her plan unraveled. The host, a tall, elegant man, looked right past my daughter's outstretched hand and smiled warmly at me. He greeted me by name, Mrs. Gates, and said it was a pleasure to see me again. He informed me that Mr. Dubois had prepared my usual table. I saw the flicker of shock on Chelsea's face quickly masked by a tight, forced smile. She whispered to Ryan that her assistant must have mentioned my name when booking a flimsy explanation that didn't quite convince either of them. We were led through the bustling, opulent dining room. Every table was filled with Boston's elite, the very people my children were so desperate to impress. Chelsea walked with her head held high, expecting a good table, but her confidence began to falter as the host led us past one prime spot after another. He brought us to a semi-private alcove with a commanding view of the entire room. It was clearly the best table in the house. "The founder's table," the host announced with a small bow. For a moment, Chelsea was ecstatic, her eyes wide with triumph. She thought this was for her a sign of her own rising status. But her pleasure curdled into confusion when the restaurant's celebrated head chef emerged from the kitchen. He wasn't making a grand tour of the dining room. He walked directly to our table, beamed a genuine, heartfelt smile at me, and ignored my children entirely. He took my hands and greeted me as Amelia, saying how good it was to see me and asking if everything was to my satisfaction. That's when the facade began to crack. Chelsea, desperate to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from her, began to perform. Her voice became a little too loud, her laughter a little too sharp. She started critiquing the restaurant to a nearby table of socialites, name-dropping a famous designer she'd supposedly met and questioning the vintage of the wine. But her comments fell flat. The staff, from the busboy to the sommelier, continued to approach our table and direct their attention, their respect, entirely to me. They addressed me first, they sought my approval. The socialites she was trying to impress were no longer looking at her with admiration, but with a kind of pitying confusion. Chelsea was becoming a spectacle, and the more she tried to assert her importance, the more foolish she looked. Throughout it all, I remained silent, watching her. I let her flail. I let the tension build until it was a palpable thing at our table. Ryan was visibly sweating, his gaze darting between me and his sister, the slow dawning horror of a trap closing around him becoming clear on his face. Finally, after Chelsea made a particularly clumsy comment about the decor, I decided it was time. I placed my hands flat on the table, a small, quiet gesture that made them both fall silent. I leaned forward slightly and looked directly at my daughter. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise. I told her she had been right, that appearances do matter. Then I paused before adding that she seemed to have mistaken performance for substance. The words landed in the silence, and I watched as the last bit of color drained from Chelsea's face. Her forced smile collapsed. The narrative was no longer hers to control. They were powerless, terrified, and trapped at my table, waiting for what I would do next. The silence that followed my words was heavy and absolute. Chelsea's face was a mask of disbelief, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. Ryan looked physically ill, his eyes wide with a terror that confirmed he finally truly understood. They were trapped, caught in a spotlight they had so desperately sought, and for the first time, they had no lines to say. It was in that perfect, suspended moment of silence that I saw my old friend Mr. Dubois begin to walk toward our table. He moved with a practiced, unhurried grace, his path weaving through the dining room with a purpose that drew the eyes of the tables he passed. He arrived at my side and gave a slight formal bow. He didn't acknowledge my children. His focus was entirely on me. His voice was polite, professional, but pitched just loud enough for the nearby socialites to hear every single word. He addressed me as Mrs. Gates and informed me that the quarterly benefactors report was ready for my review. He then asked if I would be taking it with me this evening. The word hung in the air between us, an elegant bomb that detonated their entire reality. I saw Chelsea flinch as if struck. The word benefactor escaped her lips not as a question, but as a choked, strangled whisper. Her mind was scrambling, trying to make sense of a truth it was not equipped to handle. I did not answer her. The time for explaining things to my daughter was over. Instead, I reached down and opened my handbag. With a slow, deliberate motion, I placed the thick, notarized incorporation documents on the crisp white tablecloth. The legal weight of the paper was a stark contrast to the delicate champagne flutes. Then I took out the small, framed photograph and gently slid it across the table toward them. It was the picture of me and the head chef. Years ago, our faces bright with laughter on the restaurant's chaotic, joyful opening night. I let them stare at the evidence for a long moment before I spoke again, my voice calm and steady. I told them that I had been so disappointed when the board suggested we name the restaurant after me. It had seemed so ostentatious. So I explained we had settled on Aurelia instead, my mother's name, a quiet tribute. The judgment from the room was instantaneous and devastating. The table of socialites who had been watching the drama unfold with fascination fell completely silent. I saw a woman's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. A low murmur rippled through the surrounding tables as the truth clicked into place for everyone watching. The host's greeting, the chef's personal welcome, the staff's unwavering deference, it all made sense now. Chelsea and Ryan were exposed. They were not just cruel and ungrateful children. They were spectacular fools who had publicly scorned the very source of the status they so desperately worshipped. The humiliation was absolute, a silent execution of their social identity in front of their peers. I looked at my children, truly looked at them, and the anger I had held on to was gone, replaced by a profound and bottomless sadness. They looked so small. I stood up, my movements smooth and unhurried. My voice, when I spoke my final words to them, was devoid of malice. I said I believed they had been concerned about appearances. Then I told them that they no longer needed to worry about being seen with me because this was the last meal we would ever share together. I gestured to their plates and told them to please finish their dinner. It was, after all, already paid for. With that, I gave a small, appreciative nod to Mr. Dubois. I turned my back on my children and walked away, leaving them frozen and alone in the bright, unforgiving spotlight of their own public disgrace. I didn't look back as I walked out of Aurelia. The cold Christmas Eve air felt clean, a welcome contrast to the overheated, suffocating atmosphere I had left behind. I didn't wait for a taxi. I just began to walk, the city lights blurring around me. I didn't feel triumphant or victorious, only a deep, hollowing sadness and the quiet, firm conviction that I had done the only thing I could do. The performance was over, and I was finally free of my role. Of course, I wasn't there to see what happened next, but in a city like Boston, a story like that has wings. I heard all about it later from friends. Their exit was apparently a blur of shame. They sat frozen at the table for a full 10 minutes under the silent, pitying gaze of the entire dining room before scrambling to their feet and practically fleeing the restaurant. Their phones were already buzzing before they reached the door, a relentless barrage of messages from the very people they had tried so desperately to impress. The story of their public humiliation, of their staggering foolishness, spread through Boston's elite circles like wildfire. The doors they had leveraged their entire future to open were now permanently, irrevocably slammed in their faces. In the weeks and months that followed, I learned of the diverging paths they took. Their financial ruin, once a secret, became public knowledge, and without the social armor to protect them, their world collapsed. For Chelsea, the shame was too much to bear. She couldn't accept her own role in the disaster, so she doubled down, casting me as the villain who had maliciously set her up. Her bitterness was a poison that seeped into everything, and her marriage, already strained by debt and deception, crumbled under the weight of it. She lost everything because she couldn't let go of the lie. Ryan, however, was shattered by the event. The public shame seemed to break through his quiet complicity. About a month after that night, a simple, plain envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 handwritten words. It just said, "You were right. I am sorry." It wasn't a solution, and it didn't erase years of neglect, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile step on a long, uncertain path toward accountability. As for me, my new reality was quieter, but infinitely richer. I was no longer just a quiet suburban widow. I took an active role as the benefactor of Aurelia, using its platform to host charity events and create a mentorship program for promising young chefs from underprivileged backgrounds. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had known me for who I was, not for what I had. My life, which had felt like it was shrinking, began to expand again, filled with purpose and the authentic respect I had always deserved but had stopped demanding. Months later, on a warm spring evening, I found myself sitting at the founder's table once again. This time, my companion was my dear friend, Mr. Dubois. We were sharing a bottle of wine, laughing about an old memory. I looked out over the bustling, beautiful restaurant, a place filled with warmth and life, a place I had built in secret. There was no anger left in my heart, no bitterness, only a quiet, powerful peace. I had reclaimed my dignity not through a grand act of vengeance, but by simply choosing to live in the truth of my own value, a simple truth that my children in their desperate pursuit of appearances had been too blind to see. In the end, Amelia's quiet victory wasn't just about revenge. It was a painful lesson in value. Her children were so consumed with the performance of status that they failed to see the real power their mother held all along. Their public humiliation wasn't a punishment she cruelly inflicted, but a natural consequence they earned. By chasing a glittering image, they scorned the quiet substance that had given them everything. They learned that the highest social standing is worthless without the basic dignity to honor where you came from, and true respect is a currency no amount of money can buy.